thank you everyone for joining today's discussion, Using Data to Address Inequality in Development, with Harvard Kennedy School professors Rema Hanna, Zoe Marks, and Asim Khwaja. I'm Christian Flynn, the program director at the Harvard Kennedy School's Executive Education, and thank you for joining us. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Charlotte Tuminelli, to tell you more about today's session, introduce our faculty panel, and tell you a little bit about our leading smart policy design that Charlotte and I are collaborating on with our faculty who are participating today. Thanks so much, and Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks so much, Christian. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to say a few words of welcome, starting by introducing our faculty and then explaining a little bit about the program that's kind of the inspiration behind today's webinar. So first, we are very lucky to have with us Professor Asim Khwaja, the director of the Center for International Development here at the Kennedy School and the Sumitomo Fasid Professor of International Finance and Development. Asim helped co-found the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, and his own research ranges from understanding market failures in emerging financial markets to examining the private education market in low-income countries. Next, we have Professor Zoe Marks. Professor Marks is a lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Her research and teaching interests focus on the intersections of conflict and political violence, race, gender and inequality, peace building, and African politics. Finally, we have with us the faculty chair of the Leading Smart Policy Design Executive Program and today's moderator, Professor Rema Hanna. Professor Hanna is the Jeffrey Cheah Professor of Southeast Asia Studies, and she is the chair of the International Development Program at the Kennedy School. She also serves as the faculty director of Evidence for Policy Design at Harvard Center for International Development, and is the co-scientific director of the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab Southeast Asia office in Indonesia. Her research revolves around improving the provision of public services in developing and emerging nations, particularly for the very poor. So as I mentioned, Rema is the chair of this fall's Leading Smart Policy Design program, and Zoe and Teddy are also teaching in it. This is an executive program developed at Harvard Kennedy School and offered by Harvard Kennedy School Executive Education and Evidence for Policy Design. It's designed for leaders and their teams who are charged with designing and delivering policies or programs that address social and economic problems around the world. Our upcoming session will highlight our faculty's research on a number of topics, including gender equity, environment, health, microfinance, education, labor market policies, and social protection system strengthening. So it will combine faculty lectures with daily applied group work in which participants will work on solving problems that they care about. We're excited to be offering this program, and I'm very happy that today will give you an opportunity to hear a little bit from some of the faculty who will be teaching in it. I hope you will take a look at the information on the website that Christian put the link to in the chat and join us for this online program. So without further ado, let's turn to today's session. Please join me in welcoming our faculty, and Rema, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you, Charlotte, for the great description. And just before we start, I also want to say thank you to the EPOD training team and to the Harvard Executive Ed team for bringing us all together here today. And thank you to all the participants for joining us. We know everybody has really busy days, but these are really important topics. And so we're really glad that you're able to be here and engage with us on them. For me, it's really exciting to be here today. I get to interview two of my colleagues who I adore and get to learn more about their work, as well as get their policy insights given the COVID-19 crisis, the crisis around the rising food and fuel prices, and many other challenges that are facing us here today. So I would like to kick it off with a series of different questions. And I should note, I want to thank everybody for sending in their questions in advance. The questions that I'm going to use in today's panel either come directly from or accumulation of several questions from all of you here today. And so we really wanted to try to address the challenges, the issues, and the topics that you were very interested in. Okay, so I don't want to take up that much time because I really want to hear from Asim and Zoe. So I'm going to start today's panel by asking Zoe and Asim to share a little bit about how they're thinking about data as the world deals with and starts to recover from the COVID-19 crisis, especially considering how much inequality, global inequality, has been increasing over the last few years. So I'm going to start with you, Asim, and ask you, what in your view are the most critical policy issues for thinking about and addressing poverty and inequality right now? And what are the kinds of data that you're seeking to gain or collect or use to try to start thinking about these issues? I know it's a big question to start it off.
Rema has a lovely way of showing how much she adores you by asking you really, really hard questions in a public forum. No jokes apart, I think it's exactly the right question to be asking. And I'm going to get my revenge by turning back to Rema on her views on this, because she's acting as a moderator, but she's far more knowledgeable on some of these things than I am, at least. And so, but let me respond to it in two ways. First of all, look, let's just set the stage of where we are and why this question is so important. First of all, we have emerged from the worst crisis we have had in at least 100 years. I think it's very important to recognize that. It's very important for us to acknowledge, because that gives a certain call for modesty and being realistic in what has happened to us, how much we have suffered, and the challenge we have to move forward. I don't mean this as a way to discourage us. I mean this actually quite the opposite, as a way to say, count every success, no matter how small it sounds, as a huge achievement, because this is a very, very tough situation we collectively have been exposed to. Look, aggregate shocks are hard enough when everyone is hit with the shock is hard enough. This kind of shock and the way this has exacerbated inequality and revealed serious fractures in our institutions and decision-making is very revealing. Okay, so that's one context. The second context is very much related to Rema's second part, which is the kinds of data we seek, which is we've also come to realize we're living in a infodemic as much as we're living in a pandemic. The infodemic being there's lots of data that is available and lots of data that exists, but somehow our ability to extract information which is useful from that data is challenged. I'm not saying it's challenged because we have more data, although some would argue that the data overload makes you like a deer in headlights, right? You're getting too much data and you don't know what to do. But I do think it calls into question something that the course we're talking about really has you consider much more, which is how do you extract intelligence, actionable intelligence, from this amazing wealth of information you have. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. And so imagine we're trying to figure out what was the impact spatially of COVID. So think of, and this is something I was involved in. Right in the beginning of the crisis, we were considering two really difficult questions. Should we lock down to prevent spread of COVID, or and thereby risk economic prosperity, business activity, educational activity, health access, create more health problems by having people with chronic illnesses, diabetes or others not get access to the facilities they need, by worsening maternal mortality outcomes. These are real trade-offs we were making. And a lot of countries went one way or the other. Some were aggressive in lockdown, some were relaxed in lockdown. But one thing in common was that we used data, we did use data, but we used data in very crude ways. We used data in very aggregated ways. We judged our country often as one unit. We judged maybe at best a state as one unit. If you were truly savvy about the data you have, the level of disaggregation of the raw data was much more nuanced, much more subtle. We could have instituted policies which were differential literally by neighborhood in a city. And my own sense is much like you think of a health treatment where imagine you have a cancerous growth and you're trying to figure out where to extricate that cancer or where to eradicate, where to put chemicals or radiotherapy, you would target that. We could have targeted our lockdowns, and yet most of us didn't. And to me, that is really a stark failure of having data, which could have allowed you to do that, but not really deeply thinking about how we could have had data lead to very sophisticated, very tailor-made policy responses. And so that's just one stark example. Now, the first part of the question, Rema, which is, and so for me, the kind of data is less about this data set or that data set. It's, are we allowing the data that exists to be used in the subtle, nuanced, tailored, bespoke ways that different parts of our community, different parts of our peoples need, right? And I think you need a certain analytical mindset and awareness to do that. And that's something I know, Rema, you lead and emphasize a lot in the course. The first part, which is interesting, is what, in my view, are the critical issues of addressing poverty and inequality? And I could answer this in two ways. I could answer it, and I have actually some views on this. But I want to pose a different way of thinking about this, which is, should I be the one making that call, right? One thing I've found with data more and more is, can data be used to empower people to voice their own problems, right? And so it could be that as an expert sitting outside, someone who studied 20 years on education in country X, I have some views over here. But I would love some way to percolate up problem identification from the communities I'm trying to help, because I may have certain blind corners in my own analysis. Let me give you one example which illustrates that. And I'm going to have one other example, which I don't think were Rema's blind spot, but it was my blind spot, which Rema reminded me of in her work that she does. So I was involved in the earthquake in Pakistan. You know, there was similar crisis. It's a national level crisis. This was the 2005 earthquake in the northern areas. One thing we started doing was, we had a sense of what the problems may be: food relief, health outcomes, sort of immediate emergent response outcomes. We still created a portal through which we could let people tell us what they felt was their problem. And something which emerged, which was really interesting and in hindsight obvious, but ex ante stupidly missing in my mind, was the demand for prosthetics. Now think about it. This is week one into an earthquake. I am mostly and someone involved in the policy discourse thinking about how to deliver packets of food and blankets to these areas. And yet someone from these areas is seeing, we have someone whose leg just got amputated. We need a prosthetic. And why is that an interesting thing to point out? This was not an immediate need, but guess what? In week 3 or week 4, we had a severe shortage of prosthetics. Simply didn't have enough prosthetics in the country. And now you're in this weird backlog where you're trying to play desperate catch up. If you had given voice earlier on, you could have prepped up the production processes while you're delivering food. At the same time, go to the manufacturing facilities and prosthetics and say, guys, move away from producing soccer balls or surgical instruments in a country like Pakistan to start, we will help you produce prosthetics. You can imagine the same thing would have been with masks or PPE during the pandemic. So voicing needs, and so I'm all now, Rema, for that question to say, I want to have my views and I'm happy to share them as we have further discussion, but I want to try and set up a system through which the people we're trying to help are able to voice what they think they are facing as their first order problems. And as much as we are researchers, I want to be sitting this meta level to say, have we set up this process? And secondly, once the data comes in, have we set up intelligent response processes? And the last thing I would say, Rema, and this is to you, is something you told me when in Indonesia, the crises hit. I was trying to think who are worst hit. And in my mind, my natural thing would be poor people are worst hit. And your work showed to me that it was actually urban migrants. It was rural migrants into urban areas who generally aren't necessarily the poorest people who are worst hit because they didn't have the social safety systems to go back to their home areas. And these are people who are not typically in the welfare system. So to recognize that you had to change, and I'm just putting words in your mouth, Rema, hoping that you will elaborate on this later on, is you were forced to think about adjusting your poverty alleviation programs to include a new set of people who had just been shocked into poverty. And that's just amazing use of data in a way that gives us super important real-time policy insights and responses. Let me stop.
No, thank you, Asim. Just to quickly catch on 2 things you mentioned, I think on the second one, I think this is very important. As we start thinking about programs and policies, they're not static. They need to change based on the changing needs in the country, and our tools to gather information on what are the challenges and who's being hit by different challenges and how can we help them has to be very flexible. And so one of the things, and I won't get into it now because we'll talk about it a bit in the course, is really thinking about the design of, can we take social protection systems, which are usually very static in many countries, and think about how to make them more flexible and responsive. The second thing I wanted to note on is I agree with you as well about trying to understand the needs of citizens. I'm going to punt on that for a moment, because for me, a lot of that is also trying to bring in a lot of qualitative work into the work we're doing, where you talk to people and understand those needs. And I'm going to that's a question I have for Zoe in a bit, but I want to first by starting to ask Zoe a very similar question that I asked you. Really thinking about, what do you really think are the critical policy issues for addressing poverty and inequality right now, and particularly thinking about how the politics are interacting with the policy landscape on these issues these days. Thank you.
Thank you, Rema, and it's great to be in conversation with you and Asim, especially in what's otherwise usually our summer hiatus, and it's great to have everyone here today with us. I want to maybe start sort of where Asim started, which is like, what were we not talking about or sort of demoting in terms of priorities because of COVID-19, because the pandemic response felt urgent. It felt like it was maybe a short-term heavy-handed response was going to limit how long this was interrupting our lives, our systems, our markets, our well-being. And so I think that there are some really, really high level conversations that remain ongoing, but that were not necessarily integrated into how we were thinking about the pandemic and trying to have a sort of holistic developmental mindset. And so the first is really just around inclusivity. As we've seen with the kind of outcomes on the COVID-19 indicators, thinking about who's worst off in society, who's systematically excluded from healthcare, who has the longest distance to travel to work, even though they're an essential worker. All of these things are sort of intimately connected to inclusive development, inclusive growth, things that have become part of our sort of ongoing conversation. I would argue that during COVID-19, that was pushed aside or sort of forgotten until it was almost too late. And then it was, again, this question of a compound crisis and remediating these widening gaps that were both health related and sort of material or well-being related in other dimensions. The second thing that it feels as though it's ubiquitous, and yet I would argue during the pandemic was forgotten or that was interrupted, was the conversation around sustainable development and how we're thinking about sustainability in tandem with maximizing our relationship to the environment, in tandem with other environmental crises, right? It's very hard to continue doing different forms of disaster preparedness, different forms of green planning, different forms of kind of sustainable growth and structural transformation when there's this sort of pandemic that's all anyone is talking about, all that anyone can prioritize funding for. And so I think that we almost lost 2 years of really thinking more dynamically and creatively while the climate crisis is kind of accelerating, while disasters seem to be getting worse and hitting the poorest people and hitting countries that have kind of the weakest infrastructural supports to sustain those shocks. And then the third is something that's getting closer to the politics part of the question, which is conversations around sort of, in the US, we talk about it in terms of systemic racism. In other countries, we think about it in terms of historical exclusion or marginalization. But there's a real interest in thinking about how do we address these persistent political, sort of man-made inequalities. And I think that as well, it's not unrelated to inclusive development or inclusive growth, but it's a little bit different because it's about groups of people and it's about discrimination and bias and people who are sort of excluded by design. And now we're trying to figure out how do we undo those harms. And I think that as well, we've seen the sort of waves of protest, not only in the US, but around the world, that actually persisted. Civil resistance, social movements continued through the pandemic because these harms had not gone away. And so I think those are 3 big things that for me are kind of top of how I think about kind of poverty alleviation and development in the world today that I saw really being interrupted. That conversation was interrupted in a really big way in the pandemic. And that goes kind of above and beyond how we think about individuals, households, communities, work sectors, et cetera, being affected by the pandemic and the health effects, as well as the economic and policy effects. But it's also about, kind of losing our momentum on planning, losing our momentum on innovation and connecting big issues together. On the sort of, so those are things that we were working towards. I think there are other things that people talk about a lot that are just worth mentioning here in case they're on the minds of our participants. These are things that seem to have gone unaddressed still in my world, and maybe they're being really innovated on in your world. So you can tell us about it in the chat or in the Q&A. But, jobless growth and violence and conflict, I think, continue to feel like they're relatively stable and intractable problems that if we aren't willing to put our minds to something that is seemingly frustrating and unrewarding to work on, it's going to continue to kind of eat away at what otherwise could be gains in those other domains. On the politics of all this, I think, it's an interesting question. So I'm a political scientist, as you know, but for our audience, I do a lot of work thinking about power, thinking about inequality, and thinking about how policies interact with that. And I think it's important to know that we're in the 16th year of democratic recession. So while we're all really preoccupied with global economic recession, imagine 16 years of that for democracy. And we've also seen at the same time that there's this sort of authoritarianism that's taking root in what are called electoral autocracies, or it's electoral authoritarianism, which means that we have elections in a lot of countries, but we don't have democratic legitimacy. We don't have popular accountability, and we're seeing that expanding. And so, what does that mean? It means that the politics of poverty alleviation at best are really about political leaders grasping for which issues have traction with voters, which issues can lead to tangible results in term limits, right? So in 4 or 5 or 7 years. And then when you have electoral authoritarianism or full-scale authoritarianism, it's not even so much about the elections, but rather about kind of a heavy-handed state-sponsored vision for what growth should look like and who should be served. And so I think, there are big debates that are had around how much can be achieved with less political transition and less political turnover. But the flip side of that is democracy is usually the tool by which people, polities, communities have their voices heard. And so somewhere between this kind of like big system level, how do we think about poverty and development today? And how do we think about kind of Asim's point, which is like hearing from people what they need? The political system is what's supposed to connect those conversations, right? Political representatives are supposed to be able to think, if not for the long game, at least for the medium game. And so that sort of middle time horizon is why we elect representatives. It's why people delegate authorities for planning, so that it's not just, this is what my community needs today because of the earthquake or the flood or the storm that happened last week or last month, or this is what my community in multi-generational poverty and marginalization is still searching for. It's a question of how do we link that to broader development strategies? How do we make inequality something that's politically rewarding to fix? And up till now, it hasn't usually been politically rewarding to really solve inequalities. It's more rewarding to talk about them and then build a road. And that's a real challenge for both democratic politics and also for authoritarian politics.
No, thank you. No, I completely agree. I think, for me, one question I always get is this idea of like, why is the data and evidence and all of these things are important? And if in the end, it's all about politics. And, the politics are always going to be there. And in fact, as you highlighted, in part, the politics have bad aspects, but they also have the good aspects of that. Exactly the point that you made and Asim made of trying to get at what do citizens want, what do they need, and how can they get the services they require in order to promote healthy and happy lives and growth and so forth. And, for me, this is where data and evidence can provide some transparency over what do we know, what do we don't know, what would we know that works, how can we do better, and help people think about trade-offs they make in advocating through the political process. And so I think this is very important that, as we have these conversations on data, that we don't abstract away from the broader politics in the world, and we actually talk about the intersection between the two. And I hope we get to do a little bit more of that in the course. But just, I know I just shot a very serious question at you, Zoe. I'm gonna go back to you and get back to actually this point that Asim made at the beginning, and that you also raised about, we could spend a lot of time talking about what we think people need, but in reality, we want people to speak for themselves, and we want to understand and learn as a society, as policymakers, as researchers, what are the issues people are grappling with, why, what are their preferences, for one type of policy versus another, or one type of service or another, for me, as a data wonk, I actually spend a lot of my time doing serious qualitative work to try to understand and learn more, and it often changes my perceptions of even how I think about data or approach it, or the hypotheses I have. So I would like to bring this back to you, Zoe. We had several of the participants in today's session really wanting to know about how do you use qualitative and descriptive work, and maybe if you can conceptualize this with an example from your own work about how do we fit it into thinking about how do we improve policy making, particularly given that in all of these, as we're thinking about a lot of these inequalities that exist.
Thanks, Rema. I love this question. And I know Asim has something to say about it, I'm sure. And I want to sit in the chorus and hear how you talk about this from your own work. I think, we all approach it in different ways, but there are probably some pretty important similarities that we can share, and that maybe others are practicing already and they think that they're drawing outside the lines, right? And so part of this is here to discipline and manage the tools that we know we need and that we otherwise would reach for, and maybe pretend that we didn't rely on so much. So I do a lot of qualitative and mixed methods work. That's my exclusive domain. I count things when I need to get trends and patterns and be able to describe the parameters of problems and people and communities that I'm working with. But then when it comes to really the content of people's experiences of things, or the nature of a problem and how it's changed over time, that's where I almost always am relying on either qualitative data or social network data. So looking at relationships between people or between actors. The first thing I wanted to flag is something that Asim mentioned, which is using qualitative work. And here I'm talking about it broadly. I'll come back to some of the nuts and bolts of what tools I use the most, but whatever it means to the audience, that's what I'm talking about. This is things that we describe with words or visuals and conversations, not just with counting things systematically. And it's really going back to this idea of qualitative tools, qualitative data is best, I think, for identifying unseen dynamics. And these are, sometimes there are sort of blind spots, the stuff that we didn't know to ask questions about. There's one of the most rewarding and frustrating things of fielding surveys of community members is when you have an open-ended question and you find out that people have a lot to say about something and none of your quantified questions are capturing that phenomenon. But that, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg, and thinking about how conversations with people, simple interventions like adding open-ended questions to survey instruments, those are great ways to begin capturing things that we would otherwise not know we didn't know, or not think were kind of intimately connected with the problem or challenge that we're investigating. So that's the primary motivation for me. The secondary motivation is going back to this idea of empowering communities and stakeholders and ensuring that policymaker priorities, political agendas, funding sources aren't determining solely the kind of scope of the knowledge that's created from an investigation, right? So I'm working from a research perspective. We're trying to create knowledge for the sake of knowledge and also for the sake of impact. A lot of people who are working in organizations have an even more explicit mandate. And it's really important to think about, how does our mandate actually empower the stakeholders or beneficiaries that we want to see, empowered, or who we want to serve through our work. And qualitative work can be an effective tool just for voice giving, as well as for those blind spots. In terms of kind of some of the tools or techniques that I'll just share quickly, and I do want to hear what you and Asim have to say, and also I know we have a lot more questions to get through. I do a lot of interviews. Interviews are incredibly costly with time, right? So to have a good conversation with somebody, you need at least an hour and they need at least an hour. And so that can quickly multiply to, 2 weeks of my life and a lot of time out of people's days who otherwise have mouths to feed, workplaces to get to, travel to complete, et cetera. So in addition to interviews, I rely on focus group discussions. They have a really different benefit though. I think a lot of people think, oh, and a focus group is like, you get people together and it's like a group interview and suddenly you can interview 10 people in the amount of time it would take to interview one. That's not the case. A focus group enables you to see how are the social dynamics unfolding for the topic or question that you're engaging with. And so it's much less about what's the kind of empirical response that you get and more about how do people talk about these issues together. And that can sometimes be a microcosm of how a community talks about it, but sometimes not. And so sort of the most efficient, but in some ways it's seen as the least reliable way to gather qualitative data is through observation. And this is really about immersing yourself in a community, talking to people at a cafe. I was most recently, I didn't travel for 2 years almost, but finally got out of the house, out of the pandemic lifestyle and went to Northeast Nigeria, where I was in Maiduguri and Borno State working on kind of community reintegration and peace building processes in the area affected by the Boko Haram conflict. And that's a place where there are pretty gender segregated social spaces, but also lots of kind of public squares. And that is an opportunity to sit down at what's basically a public square and hear what the conversations are. So you can be really creative in thinking about what voices does our project or our inquiry or our research need to hear, and then think about how do you stitch those together with qualitative work to match that data or information overload that you're trying to navigate and think about it more strategically.
Oh, thank you. I know for me, I also as well, having not traveled for 2 years and finally getting to travel again this summer, I really realized the difference, especially at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. As Asim said, we're trying to figure out who were the segments of people who are being most hurt. We had a lot of theories. We were trying to bring in data, but the ability of not being able to travel and talk to people and understand needs, I think might have led to a lot of the confusion that there was at the beginning in terms of trying to put out an effective policy response. And so given all of that and the successes that were still had in many countries in terms of trying to provide cash transfers and other, food transfers if necessary and other types of support for those who are being hit, I think is something that, we really need to just understand how difficult that was and how amazing it was that was being able to get done. I'm going to turn it back to you, Asim. I saw you anxious to respond to the qualitative question, so I'll let you do that too. But the next question I had for you was on the topic of education. I mean, this is when we think about inequality, for me, this is what keeps me up at night and what makes me very worried is that in many countries around the world, schools shut down. And for a lot of low-income and middle-income countries, there is online learning programs, but particularly in rural areas and households for low-income kids, the internet was just not there. And so you have this situation where you worry that kids have lost, up to 2 years of schooling. Will they go back? If they go back, how do you take a 5-year-old that's been out of school for 2 years and suddenly acclimate them back in? Even just getting them to sit and focus when they haven't, been had that kind of experience in quite the same way. So I do want to turn it back over to you, Asim, to really be thinking about these issues in education. And I know it's another really big topic, but are there any insights you can offer us?
Great. Thank you, Rema. Let me respond first to, I just want to double click on what Zoe said in terms of qualitative data. But, and let me say it as a perspective of someone who, this is Zoe's space, so I defer a lot to her, but I'm the kind of guy you wouldn't expect to be using qualitative data. And I'm hoping that by me double clicking on what Zoe said, it lends even further credence to say, even people like me who are quantitative data monkeys in many ways, actually recognize and deeply use qualitative data. The problem is you don't see it in our papers when we write them, because in my discipline, that's not a section you write. But it's very clear to me that had I not done that, my paper would have been so much more worse. And let me tell you 2 ways in which that's the case. And then I'm just going to move to the next question, because I think Zoe just did a fabulous job of kind of explaining this. The 2 ways it's really helped me is, one, anytime I do a survey, which is a structured survey, by definition, I am going to categorize a response in a way that is going to mute the person's voice, not necessarily completely prevented, but I'm going to filter their voice through a particular set of options that I give them, right? We try in our surveys to develop those options after a much more open conversation, so we try and capture everything. But even despite that, there is a constraint that imposes. So what I've done in my work to where does that penalize you in your work? It penalizes you in 2 ways. One is you may in my field get obsessed with causal inference, and I am. You may say X causes Y, in a sense that a movement in X creates better Y. In the education context, we'll come to quickly, Rema, is I randomly introduce a better textbook in a school, and I see that I raise test scores by 15%. That's really powerful. The problem is, if you really sat down and asked me to say, take that statistic which you just gave and tell me how that happened, the honest answer is I will kind of BS my way through if I don't have qualitative data. Now, contrast that same study with one where I had that textbook and I did exactly what Zoe said. I sat myself being a hypothetical person observing the world, in a participant way, in a way that didn't affect that. I was a secret participant. I was an invisible participant. And I was observing what's actually happening as that textbook showed up in the classroom. And I see that that textbook suddenly gets the kid much more excited. I see rustling of pages. I see books opening. I see kids whispering to each other. That's a very different dynamic from the old book and silence, right? Knowing that qualitative information allows me to give a much better theory of change for why that book made a difference. And why is that important? Because that theory of change is actually the deeper mechanism. And what I may infer from that study is not, oh, I introduced a good textbook and that was good. That's good. But what are the other things I could do which would generate the same effect? What there are things which are mediated through the kid getting more engaged and excited in the classroom. That's what the better textbook did. And so that allows me to both interpret my policy, but also jump to the next likely policy intervention, which could be working through the same deeper channel. So that's one thing. I think is critical, interpreting why what you did is having an effect. The second thing is actually figuring out what to do. I jumped a big step over here, which is, where did I come up from that textbook idea? Why did I pick textbooks out of the 50,000 things I could have done? And there's another way to use qualitative data, which is before you even introduce this, you sat in the class and you actually saw one big thing which just hit you in the face constantly was there was no energy or excitement in the class. People were just on some depressing drug, right? You were just sitting there and everyone was kind of glazed out, bored. I hope that's not how you're observing our current webinar, that you are engaged and excited, but if I could see your faces, I could tell whether that's true or not, right? And so having that qualitative data to begin with would suggest what kind of interventions would work, the reverse of that. And that's those dynamics are really powerful. I think qualitative data, I use it a lot, even though I don't write about it because I don't know where to write in my discipline on it, but it's very useful. And I think it's important to highlight that. To your question on education, look, it's something which keeps all of us up at night on a very personal level and a research level and a look at the world around you level. It's also very scary because it's an illness which will manifest itself in 25 years. It's a shock that you see now, but we're kind of ignoring it. Like I remember being in a conversation with someone I deeply respect, Bridget Long, who's the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we were in a public seminar and we were talking about this. And I said, hey, Bridget, sometimes I wonder if we made a huge mistake, which is we should have just accepted the shock and said, everyone is going to repeat the year. Everyone. Now think of how strong a statement that is, that you say, we recognize we have not taught kids, we're going to hold everyone back. Now that's not something that any one person can do. That can only be done if the entire ecosystem agrees to core. I'm not saying we should have done that, but the fact that I'm even contemplating that, and Bridget didn't laugh me off and say, Asim, get off the damn stage, is a testament to that this was actually a potential option we could have. This is how severe the problem is, right? The reality is we couldn't make that move, but also the reality is that the world is somewhere in between. We cannot ignore the fact that we and our children have lost maybe a year, maybe a year and a half, maybe even 2 years of learning, maybe even more than 2 years of learning. How can we lose more than 2 years learning? We have a 2-year shock. If you lose a certain foundational aspect and you jump ahead, you can actually make things worse. Lant Pritchard is a colleague of ours who has this, I think it's a book or an article, which is teaching more is teaching less, which is you end up teaching stuff which is way ahead of what you should know. You end up even not teaching the stuff you should have taught, basically. So you actually have the kid lag behind, especially if that discourages it, especially if you infer from that I'm stupid, not that I'm being taught something which is really hard or unfair. And if you make that inference, if you think that you're not good enough to learn, that's a really damaging and dangerous thing. And I think several of our kids may be facing that. They may think, why am I not getting this concept? Gosh, I must not be good in math. I must not be good at English. I must not be good at subject X. And what is really happening is we're teaching them in an unfair way. We didn't prepare them. So that's a really dangerous inference. So that's the world. And look, I don't want to scare us all, but I do want to scare us all, in the sense that I want us to say, guys, we got to take this seriously. We got to give this the credit it's due. Now, is there a silver lining here? Absolutely. And I want to flag a thing I said in the past and a thing you said. I said, make policy targeted. And Rema, you said something which I love, and which is dynamic policy. What does dynamic policy look like? I actually think, and I'm beginning to do a lot of work in Pakistan, where I'm currently sitting in education, where we're saying, can we use data at a very disaggregate level to figure out for each child, what level is that child at, okay? Currently, they may be in 5th grade, but some of them were lucky and actually are still in 5th grade in terms of their understanding because their parents were compensating. Others are sitting at 3rd grade, okay? Let's first use data to assess for every child where they are. Once we have that, let's give them instruction which is targeted to the level at which they currently are, okay? Let's recognize that you're at 3rd grade not because you are smart or not smart, is because somehow you are not able to receive the education that we should have provided. Let's start with that as our starting impulse. It's us that are failing them, not them failing themselves. Okay? Once you start with that impulse, we try and correct it. So that's the part about tailoring the instruction spatially to the level of each child. I think it's doable with technology, and we're actually doing this in Pakistan right now. The second is what you said, which is harder, and we're trying to figure out how to do it, which is, let's say I target my instruction. Let's say, Rema, I find out that you are brilliant and you didn't lose anything, and you can perfectly do fractions now. And I, who should have been able to do fractions, am struggling with double-digit addition, okay? And so I get the double-digit addition lesson, you get the fraction addition lesson. We're both in grade 5, okay? But I want to be dynamic about it. I don't know whether you and I respond in the same way. So it could be that you and I have the same latent ability, and I hope we do. And even though I'm starting behind you because I didn't get the resources that maybe, Rema, you had, I will respond really rapidly. And so now the curriculum you put me in is not double-digit addition for the next 6 months. You put me in double-digit addition and rapidly you move me to fractions, the first sign you see that I'm getting this. So that I'm converging to you, I'm beginning to catch up to you. Not that I'm holding you back, Rema, but I'm realizing that Asim was in a temporary state of shock and can quickly converge up to Asim's real potential. Rema, you're sitting at your potential. So that requires not just targeted instruction, but dynamically adjusting your targeting over time. You can do that as well, because data can tell you. Once I gave Asim the digit addition, I can see next week whether Asim understood it by testing us. And then rapidly changing what Asim does. Now, there could be a different version of Asim who's so shocked that actually it'll take them a year to catch up or 2 years to catch up. And I should be allowing for that to happen. So that's the world I think we can create in the pandemic. And I think the pandemic is actually forcing us to create that world, which honestly, we should have always had. It's not that this is the world we only needed post-pandemic. We always needed this world. And now it's just become obvious that we need it.
No, thank you, Asim. I think, I agree with you completely. Even before the pandemic, there's been a lot of research that has been done in recent years, really understanding how teaching to the right level really helps improve both educational quality and achievement, but also self-confidence and excitement, and really trying to improve the broader sense of learning. And so I agree with you. I think that's particularly important now, given the time out of school, and how can we use those insights from before to try to think about how can we better improve the way we deliver educational services. I have so many more questions, but I know we're running out of time. So I'm going to skip to, I got 2 questions yesterday that I think are very, really important and interesting. And so I'm going to try to get those in under the wire. So this came from one of our participants yesterday. Thank you again for sending in the questions. And I think either both Zoe and Asim, getting your views on this would be very interesting. But I think one of the questions we had was, how do we think about the role of civil society organizations in helping governments be more committed to data-driven policymaking? And so I think a lot of people, a lot of our participants were particularly interested in this question. And so I don't know if either of you have particular views you would like to share. Okay, I see Asim smiling. I see Zoe smiling. Why don't we start with Zoe and then I'll kick it over to Asim.
I'm guessing Asim has a specific example, but I was just going to say, civil society is fantastic because it's motivated and usually better coordinated than the society that it represents as a whole, and also sometimes better coordinated than the government officials who are tasked with kind of linking together disparate parts of a very large machine and making things happen in an effective and efficient way. So I think that the most important thing is to think about just the power of asking questions, right? So what are the indicators that you're going to use to assess this new policy? That way, civil society can think about either following up and asking for the data report, or collecting parallel data or their own data, or maybe saying, you know what, the way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to count this isn't going to meet our community's needs. We're going to do a qualitative complement, right? So that's one thing, is to think about both ask the question, think about whether the government needs your support and or oversight or duplication. And then thirdly, to think about complementarity. I think that's probably the most important thing in terms of the government to civil society relationship, is really just pushing accountability because you've built the relationships with the key policymakers or implementation agents within government. And I think the second part of it is really to think about how do you translate what government might be doing, what data they might have access to the communities who are supposed to be benefiting from this, and who also ultimately are the arbiters of whether it's impactful and whether it's meeting their needs and priorities. And so I think it's kind of moving the data in the opposite direction, then having civil society be really involved in disseminating data that government has access to, that it's not always quick to publish, and also translating that into sort of ordinary language so that people can understand what this represents and why it may or may not resonate with their own experience.
No, I completely agree on the accountability and transparency. And I'm also going to add in one more. I've also, for me at least, where civil society plays a role is that if they're very marginalized groups that don't necessarily have a voice, civil society often helps act as that voice and make sure that they're included in the data and make sure their views are heard as we think about their needs as well. But I see Asim wanting to jump in. And so we don't have much time, so I'm going to just make sure you remember that.
At the risk of, or in the interest of not making this feel too pre-planned, I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
No, well, not disagree is a strong word. I'm going to give a different view here.
Okay.
I don't deny what Zoe said into the civil society, but I would put my weight in a slightly different way. I would say, I want to think very explicitly, and maybe this can be rephrased in language Zoe said, as think about the carrots and sticks for the politician, and figure out how do we make data to be both a carrot and a stick. And so in the stick sense, you can think of accountability mechanisms as stick senses, right? To say, if you don't deliver, I would like to do that much more through the political process as opposed to the civil society process. And the reason for that to me is ultimately I want to develop people expressing dissatisfaction through, not through necessarily, I'm not saying necessarily the way you said this, but in case people heard that say, let's get NGOs to kind of put pressure. I want people to express their dissatisfaction through a voting process and voting people out. And I want somehow data to come into the citizen. So when they're about to vote, they will see, I'm really unhappy about this. This guy did a terrible job. I'm going to try and vote them out. And that's not easy. Rohini Pandey, a colleague of ours, has done work in this, ex-colleague of ours about Yale. So it's non-trivial, but that's kind of what I want. On the carrot side, I think it's even harder. Like most of the things I've seen in this space is sticks coming up to politicians. It's been very hard to come up with a data carrot for a politician or even a bureaucrat. And I have some ideas here. I've tried in some spaces, not with any great degree of success, but let me just give you one small example. In education, I've been struggling a lot with political leaders and saying, why don't you care about in your village, in your constituent's village is a terrible teacher doing a shitty job teaching students. Parents are upset about it. Why are you not changing that teacher? And instead, why is most of your inroads into education about transferring some person from place A, which they're unhappy, to place B, which they want to be at? Why is that something which you think is more vote giving to you, which is about one individual who's unhappy, who wants to be moved? I mean, how many people could be possibly behind that one teacher? Like, how many siblings do they have? Or how many cousins do they have? It can't be, versus all those children who this bad teacher is kind of making this life miserable. And the response I get from politicians, whether it's true or not, is, Asim, we don't get any calls from citizens about the bad teacher and move them. We get calls about my nephew is unhappy as a teacher and please move them. And so I'm just going to respond to the calls. So they're telling me, you think this is a carrot for me, it's not a carrot for me. And so I'm trying to work with citizens now to say, why aren't you going and telling that politician, what's the failure? Do you think they won't listen to you? Do you not have an idea what your problem is? Do you not know how to express it? Do you not feel you have agency in expressing it? And it's weird because you are expressing stuff on other things. You get really upset when the road isn't made. So what? And you care about education because you're sending your kids to fancy private schools or relatively fancy or expensive private schools when there's a free public school in the area. So something is missing somewhere. And so I'm still struggling with, I'm beginning to see good accountability mechanisms with data for politicians. I'm still struggling with good reward mechanisms. But I think that's the way I'd like to think about it. And so it becomes in the interest of the politician. Because right now, when I do accountability, the data becomes like a stick I wield and you want to run away from the stick. You hide from sticks, you want to grab carrots. And so I'm in this constant world where I got my stick finally and I'm running after you and you're running away from me. And this is really bizarre now. Stop that analogy right there. Whatever imagery you have in mind, I wanted you to be running to me when I'm giving you the data. And I have a hard time doing that.
No, thank you, Asim. I mean, I have so many comments to respond to all of your statements, but we'll have to save it for another time. I do want to mention, I completely agree. And I think a lot of the work that, this is very difficult. I think it's very much our instinct to go to the negative, to point out when things are wrong. But I think for me, part of using data, part of using evidence is both thinking about what is working, what is doing well, how can we improve it further, and how can we help people do their jobs better, be it they're a politician or a bureaucrat or a teacher. And I think having a more positive outlook to data and making it less scary and making everybody understand the methods being used and making everybody understand what does the research say and how can we use it in a productive way, I think is extremely important. I would love to stay talking. I think Charlotte, can I get you back on here? I think have we run out of time?
I do think we're basically out of time. I might surface just I tried to synthesize a bunch of questions just because we're getting so much great stuff in the chat. So if folks need to leave, great, but if we can take maybe like 3 more minutes just to do a rapid fire. So we've got a lot of questions in the chat about infodemics and whether trust and evidence has increased or actually decreased in the past decade. And people are thinking about this, especially in the context of the pandemic and how data is used and abused, which has obviously very real implications for equality and equity downstream. So can you comment on trust and evidence, and how would you suggest we navigate when elected officials sow doubt in evidence?
Okay, so why don't we just 1 minute comment from Zoe. I know this is such a big question, but I'm going to do a 1 minute comment from Zoe and a 1 minute comment from Asim.
All right, I was hoping Asim would have to go first on this one. I think that, yes, trust and evidence is like in the tank or wherever these things go when they're just like plummeting out of sight. I think that one of the things that's important to think about is whether or not people are willing to also be part of sharing data. So I'm going to talk about it not so much from the user side, but from the kind of like data collection side. I think that we have this assumption that data is infinitely kind of numerous and prolific, and there are some real concerns about how do we respect privacy? How do we respect privacy when we have data from devices that are kind of sweeping up more data than people know? But also, how do we respect privacy when we're trying to have targeted and dynamic interventions, especially if we're trying to target historically excluded, marginalized, or minoritized groups, or people who have fewer rights in society. And this can sometimes be a problem if we're looking at gender inequality, for instance. And so I think that we need to think about data and information as a sort of wraparound tool or product of our society, and really make sure that we are attending to the relationship, not only of kind of data dissemination and really telling stories that are compelling and convincing and rebuilding trust in science, but also kind of respecting and rebuilding or rehabilitating our relationship to being sources of data, and what that means and how that can be a voice-giving and empowering, visibilizing project, not just an extractive kind of machine sucking your private information for the purpose of some abstract good.
Awesome, 1 minute.
I think it's a very good question. Honestly, I'm at the point where I'm thrilled that the pandemic led to data usage, because I feel like before you even begin to trust or not trust something, you need to be aware and use it. And I think data usage has gone up, which is just fabulous news. And now I think we're in the world where we want to make sure, as people are engaging more with this, we build those levels of trust. But if you didn't have usage, you're just in a totally different world. And so all else being equal, I'm super excited. I think now the onus is on us to make sure this initial usage interest grows and you build a loving relationship with data.
Right. No, thank you so much. And so I think we've run out of time. I wanted to just say, if you enjoyed today's conversation, I hope you can join us in the fall. We have the Leading Smart Policy Design program, where we'll really dig into a lot of these issues on thinking through problem diagnosis of policy problems, and bringing in group work for a lot of the things that many of you care about. Also bringing in a lot of leading experts to cover a wide range of topics that are really important in the policy space right now, going from education to gender, to social protection policies and program, health and labor markets. And so super excited if you guys can join us. Charlotte, I will turn it over to you if there's any final closing remarks. I just want to say thank you again to both the panelists and to the entire executive team and the ePod training team for putting together this event for us.
Thank you so much, Rema, and I echo all of your thanks, and thanks very much to everyone who joined us today. I think in closing, just we will email out links to the video and information about the program to everyone, so that is forthcoming.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.